Hi everyone, and welcome to MattyB's Advanced Flowing Tips for Big Questions Debate. So I'm going to be assuming that you have some prior knowledge about debate in general, and specifically big questions debate, because if I tried to cover everything that was prerequisite to this video, then it would simply be too long. So hopefully you have some knowledge and some experience in debate. And in this video, what I really want to do is talk about some of the ways that the flow helps us, and what the flow is, first of all, and also the ways that it can be used in debate and judging to evaluate, one's position. And we're going to be looking at some advanced techniques for flowing and for keeping track of who's winning in the debate. I'm making this video in 2020, but if you're watching it in future years, great. That means my legacy has lived on. So let's talk about the flow. What is the flow? It's a system of note-taking developed just for debate. And it helps keep track of everything, which is useful for both debaters and judges. You need to know what arguments were dropped, which I'll talk about in a second, what arguments are still relevant at this point in the debate, which arguments are the most important, and why. And debate flow is done in two different colors, one for the affirmative, one for negative. I like using black for the affirmative, and I like using red for the negative. It's totally up to you what colors you want to use. That's part of your system. And it's divided into sections based on the speeches. So that's going to become more clear in the next few slides when we look at an example of a layout of the flow. And in terms of strategy, it's really important to develop your own method of flowing based on your strengths and preferences. So whatever type of debater you are, whatever type of person you are, it all affects what type of flower you are. And so when you're flowing, make sure you're doing it in a way that suits you and you feel the most comfortable with. And because that's just going to help you in the long run to be an effective note taker and flower. And finally, speed is key. So in debate, arguments come and go very quickly. So it's important to develop either fast note taking or abbreviations and shortcuts in your flow in order to not sacrifice anything that's going on in the debate, but to also be able to keep track of everything very quickly. So the reason I chose this slideshow to be so weirdly sized is it's actually 8.5 by 10. In real life, it would be 8.5 by 11, but I decided to keep some clarity here. And how it works is I have it in portrait layout, as you can see, and this is my particular preference, and you can choose your preference, but how I like to do it is portrait layout so that I have plenty of room to write top down in that left section there for the affirmative constructive. And the affirmative constructive is indicated by that black line. Remember, affirmative for me is black, negative is red. The next thing that's going to happen in this debate is several more speeches. So in big questions debate, there are 8 speeches divided into 4 different sections. And so the 4 sections here is to indicate which speech we are in. So the first one is the affirmative constructive, and the second one will be the negative rebuttal, third one, affirmative consolidation, and finally the negative rationale. This is the same type of flowing that I did for Lincoln-Douglas debate. The only difference is that affirmative consolidation and negative rationale are called different things. Now, this is only 1/2 of the flow. Remember, there are 8 speeches, and there's only room for 4 here. So there also is a second page for the negative constructive. And I like to use the second page rather than the back of the first one so that I can look at both at the same time. Now, the second page for the negative constructive is very different from the affirmative in that it's just flip-flopped, right? So it's actually relatively similar, where we have the affirmative rebuttal following the negative constructive, negative consolidation, and then the affirmative rationale. So that's kind of how I like to divide it. I like to divide my pages approximately into 1/4, right, quarters, so that I have room. But sometimes the constructive speeches actually take more, so you could change the spacing and whatever system you want to use based on however you prefer. So let's jump into some terminology, which is going to be really critical for the example. I'm going to show you an example of how the flow develops, and I'm going to kind of walk us through a debate that could happen. But before we do that, I want to talk about some terminology that I'm going to be using in that example And this is where some familiarity with debate will really help you. So hopefully you've been able to have some exposure to these terms before this video, because I'm going to be going over them pretty quickly. So cross-examination, CX, is the abbreviation that I use. It's just the questioning period in debates. It's an abbreviation that I use on my flow to talk about questions that were asked or answered. A drop is a debate term which you'll hear very frequently, and the symbol or the system that I use to manage or to look at drops is empty space on the flow. So if there's ever empty space, that means an argument was dropped. And a drop means that an argument has not been responded to. So next, extend is I draw an arrow. So you'll see that in the example, but basically it means that the argument is still relevant at this point in the debate, and an argument which was made previously. So let's say the negative makes an argument in the constructive, the affirmative doesn't respond to it in the rebuttal, the negative can extend it into the consolidation and draw an arrow all the way across that second column there, which we'll see an example of. So extending is the drawn arrow, and you need to be able to qualify why you can extend this argument. So why is this argument still relevant if you are extending it? Next is group. So grouping arguments is something that you can do if there's multiple arguments. It's usually done to save time. And if you want to respond to a bunch of arguments at once, just group them together and come up with one response that does a good job of responding to all of them. And so that saves you time in your speech. Remember that you don't really have a lot of time when you're speaking. So grouping is a great way to manage many arguments at once. And so cross-applying is another great thing. Basically what it means is there's an argument which you made at some point in the debate, and you want to apply it to this argument here. Rather than restating the argument that you already made, you just say, cross-apply the argument I made earlier to this, and you're done. It's fast, it saves you time, and it is an effective thing if the argument does a good job of responding to it. Next is turn. Turn is a really valuable thing to do if you ever can, when an argument is claimed to support the opposing side. So essentially, turn is another word for when you get up there as a debater and you say, this argument that my opponent has made actually supports my side. So you can just say, turn this argument in favor of my side, whatever that happens to be. So the negative, for instance. Clash is the final term here, which I don't use as on the flow. I just write out clash if it's important to write out. But clash is a debate term that's really important, and it's going to be really important in the example that we watch here. And basically, clash is a rating of an argument's strength of opposition. There's not a really good example that I can give, but we are going to see an example of how clash is used in debate in the following example. So, put an asterisk next to that in your notes. Hopefully you are taking notes, by the way. I really hope you are taking notes. Maybe you're even flowing this for practice. So essentially, we're going to return to the concept of clash later in our example. I would not, so debate terminology, don't use any of these terms if your judge is not experienced in judging debate. If you are wanting to use one of these terms, simply go to the meaning here on the right-hand side and use that instead. So instead of saying to a judge who is inexperienced with debate, instead of saying, my opponent has dropped this argument, say, my opponent has not addressed this argument, which is why it is still relevant at this point in the debate. Or rather than saying extend, you can say something like, I'm going to repeat an argument that I made previously, which my opponent has not yet addressed. Usually extensions are done when there's a drop. If you can extend it, but there are other times when extension can happen, which we'll get into actually in the example. So hopefully all of this isn't too confusing at this point. If it is, well, maybe you can do some research about these terms. I didn't want to spend too much time on it though, because I'm assuming that you're advanced in your debate. Okay, so this is the part which was adapted from that, what's his name? Let's go back and find his name. Sung-Jo Cho, who's from LC Anderson High School, made it to NSDA finals. in 2018, and he was on the affirmative side. This is his case. This is not mine. So I flowed his case basically because it's on YouTube, and I then fictitiously came up with negative rebuttal and the affirmative consolidation and the negative rationale. I fictitiously came up with every argument after these, but because I'm not creative enough, I am adapting my flow here from his case. So many thanks to Seung-Jo Cho, and good job on your debate. So let's go down, let's just kind of go through this so that we understand what the affirmative's position is. The first thing that the affirmative brings up is framework, and I abbreviate that with FW. The affirmative makes an observation, observation 1. Fundamental is defined as essential. Essentially, that's what the argument was about, and it's a definition from Merriam-Webster, and that was the beginning of the framework. And this framework is then qualified with 2 different sub-arguments, which are that the debate needs to determine first what is essential, what is the essential property of a human, notice that it's singular property, and whether animals share it. Property, I abbreviate prop, of course, and this framework is going to be very important in evaluating the rest of the debate. The second thing that this debate needs to determine is what maintains harmony and balance in human society, and whether animals are different in that respect. So the affirmative is basically, with the framework, as in every framework, the affirmative is saying, this is the way we need to evaluate the resolution. This is the question that the resolution is asking. And so these are the things I want to evaluate and pay most attention to. Finally, in the framework, the affirmative brings up an argument, prefer the affirmative definition of fundamental, and they give a qualification for that because their definition of fundamental gives us access to have the most holistic debate. Okay, the affirmative has one contention. Contention 1, human intellect exceeds biological necessity. And then they have 2 subpoints to back that up. Subpoint A being, creation and transfer of complex abstract knowledge makes us different from other animals. And this is supported by an expert's opinion, Professor Thomas Nabling. And I have no idea if I spelled that right. I was flowing, of course. This is supposed to be realistic. And what Professor Thomas Nabling says in his expert throne is tobacco is understood as the thing which is essential, with the essential property of tobacco. So whenever we say the word tobacco, other humans understand that to mean anything with the essential property that tobacco has. So it's very complex, and the way that we form our language is more complex than what other animals do. Next, the rational thought ability of humans leads to 2 different things. So that symbol there, the equals with the greater than symbol, for me means leads to. So that's the symbol that I use. Rational thought leads to 2 things. First, conceptual thought. So our ability to rationally think gives us access to conceptual thought. And there's a professor, an expert opinion here, Professor Patrick Lee, who says that animals do not rationalize in the same way that humans do. Secondly, rational thought gives rise to the development of mathematics. And there's an expert opinion from Professor Rairos. Again, I have no idea if I'm spelling these professors' names right because it's a flow. You don't need to know. You just need to be able to speak. And notice that I have 3 question marks here. So those 3 question marks indicate that I didn't catch what this Professor Rairos said. So that's a great thing for me to ask in cross-examination if I'm the negative. And if I'm the judge and I don't catch something, I can interject between speeches, hopefully, and ask clarify what it is that this professor said. That's really important to do. Always clarify, but don't clarify too many things. Don't spend the entire questioning period clarifying. It makes you look silly and unknowledgeable. So try to catch as much as you can. Of course, you're not going to catch everything because it's flowing, it's fast. But try to minimize the amount of clarifying questions that you ask. So the next expert opinion that he has is from Ian Stewart. Only humans are capable of doing math. And certainly on the level of mathematical theories that we come up with from day to day. And then finally, subpoint B under contention 1, that humans have created a universal moral code, and that's unique to the human species. There's 3 arguments here, the first being an expert opinion from a law professor that I didn't get the name of. Humans have unique reasoning ability, which allows us to create these moral codes such as laws. And secondly, humans can confront questions that are purely ethical, right? So even though animals might be able to make ethical choices, they do not philosophize about purely ethical questions. And finally, Colleen Goldberg. Humans and animals negotiate differently. So whenever there's conflict in society, it is resolved in different ways. So that was the affirmative constructive. And at this point, I want to pause and ask you to pause the video here and think about what sort of things do you notice about my flow? What sort of things would you do differently? What kind of abbreviations would you make? Notice that many of the words that I use here are longer than I would normally do. I would actually abbreviate more because it's really just, as a big questions debater, the only person who needs to understand the flow is you. So the reason that I have these longer words here is so that I can actually present this and have people understand what it's saying. But think about in what ways you would do your flow differently and what kind of abbreviations you might want to make. Okay, so now that we've talked about the affirmative constructive, the negative takes their prep time and they're ready to do the rebuttal. And then the off-time roadmap the negative gives is, I'm going to go top down on the affirmative constructive, which is to say they're going to start at the beginning and finish at the end. Oops. What's going on here? Okay, neg rebuttal. So the first argument that the negative makes is across from the first point on the affirmative framework. So what the negative is trying to do is turn this point. What the affirmative initially said was that we need to determine in this debate what the essential property of a human is and whether other animals share it. And the negative is saying that yes, we can actually equate the essential property of a human to what is essential to other animals. So needs, and what the negative then says as examples are the needs for food, water, safety. The affirmative, or the negative, is trying to say that because we share these needs, we fundamentally share what is essential to us. So therefore we are the same. Under the affirmative framework, the negative should win a debate. Now, across from the second point, notice that the negative doesn't combine the 2 aspects of the framework and turn them. The negative only turns the first aspect of the framework and then responds to the second one by saying, human society is not harmonious or balanced, which is the same as other animal societies. So when the affirmative is trying to give you a picture of human society as being harmonious and balanced because we have complex moral structures, but that's not the case, the negative is pointing out that that's not the case, and arguing that in fact, the way that human society is organized is very animalistic, and we are not harmonious or balanced by any means. So then the negative agrees to the definition of fundamental because the negative believes that the negative can still win through the affirmative framework. So even with this definition of fundamental being what is essential to the thing, the negative can say, yes, I agree with this definition. And in fact, what is essentially different between animals and other humans and other animals, we are essentially the same. We are fundamentally the same. And so the negative believes that they can win using this definition. Now, across from the first contention, the negative might say something along the lines of, the wording of contention 1 is wrong, and also I will prove that contention 1 is wrong by disproving its subpoints. And to talk about contention 1 in the wording that it is specifically, the affirmative is trying to claim that human intellect exceeds biological necessity. However, from evolution, we know that this is not true. From evolution, we know that whatever properties an organism has, there's an evolutionary reason for that organism to possess those properties. And so if the affirmative is trying to argue that the human intellect is beyond biological necessity, this is simply untrue according to evolution. And we're not trying to deny evolution here. And then the negative says, prefer the negative's ecological framework. So what they're doing here, the negative, is tying this argument about evolution to their framework, which is not on the float. Again, that's on the negative constructive. But we're assuming that the negative in this fictitious scenario has a framework related to ecology, biology, evolution, and they're tying this argument back into that framework. So that's a great thing to do. Next, the negative is going to respond to the affirmative subpoint A. And what they do say in response to that subpoint A is that from this fictional professor, Jim Harbinger, who says that animals have highly complex languages, which is a true statement. I don't know if Jim Harbinger has ever said that, but it is a true statement. And they give 3 examples. Elephants, whose communication is beyond human hearing most of the time, and whose communication, of course, is in a very different language that humans haven't even begun to understand. The same can be said of dolphins, and even more importantly, perhaps, the same can be said of trees. So notice that trees are not an other animal, so it's not like within the resolution, but because the negative is saying that tree pheromones, which do exist as a form of communication for trees, scientifically that's been proven, what the negative is basically trying to say is that the capacity for language and complex language at that does not simply belong to humans. It's not unique to humans. And notice that this has direct clash with contention 1 subpoint A on the affirmative. And what I mean by clash is that it opposes directly the statement of that the creation and transfer of complex abstract language is unique to humans. And the negative is saying, no, it's not, for these 3, and these 3 examples prove that. Across from these points about rational thought, the negative makes the argument, which is backed by evidence from Professor Joyce Shumley, that animals do rationalize. So according to this fictional professor, it is true that animals do rationalize. And then this is another fictional thing. So let's pretend that the negative in cross-examination, so in the questioning period, the negative asked what the affirmative's definition for rationalization or rational thought, that kind of thing. And then the affirmative gave a definition, and now the negative is saying that the affirmative's own definition of rational thought is the same definition which is used by Joyce Shumley in this evidence. Basically, the affirmative has played into the negative's argument here by conceding that, or by agreeing on the definition for rational thought. The negative can then say, well, because they agree with this definition of rational thought, and it's the same definition which is used by Joyce Shumley in discussing the rationalization that animals do, we see that rationalization is not unique to humans. But critically, at this point in the speech, the neg is running out of time. The negative does not have enough time to respond to the mathematics point and subpoint B in their entirety. So the negative, in their last-ditch effort to finish the round, to finish their speech with as much on the flow as possible, makes an argument across from subpoint B, because they've already made arguments on subpoint A. So now it's time to make an argument on subpoint B, so that the affirmative can extend the entire subpoint B, that is. So the argument that the negative then makes is an argument from Professor Saeed Al-Jabi, which again is a fictitious person, who argues about the moral structures of monkey societies, which is actually a real thing. There's been documented cases of monkeys with complex communication to establish a moral order, and there's sort of a lot of bodily gestures involved and a lot of different things that are very complex that establish order in society, in the monkey society, that is. So this argument is basically, again, saying that it's not unique to humans, but notice that it's actually a relatively weak argument, and the negative has not specifically responded to humans being able to confront questions that are purely ethical. So those arguments there that I've circled have been dropped. And even just squinting your eyes and looking at this page, looking at the color only, you can kind of see that there's blank space in the negative rebuttal. And it's sort of like a leak in the debate. So for the rest of the debate, so the right-hand side of the page, the affirmative can capitalize on these two arguments because they're leaks, and a leak in a dam can turn into a cascade. So with that, the affirmative then goes on to their consolidation. And let's pretend that the off-time roadmap in the affirmative consolidation is, I'm going to go top down on the affirmative constructive, responding to my opponent's rebuttal. So they begin with the framework. Across from the turn that the negative makes, the affirmative then says that there are essential properties that we share with other animals, and there are other essential properties that we do not share with other animals. And so just by saying that because we have things in common with other animals, and very critical things such as food and water, doesn't mean that we are fundamentally the same. We are fundamentally different. And then this gives the affirmative an excellent opportunity to begin diving into what an excellent argument to make, which is about the framework, the essential properties, and then the level of difference. Okay, so let's pretend I'm the affirmative speaker here. And what I'm going to say is something along the lines of this here. My opponent and I agree about the definition of the word fundamental. But let's look at another word in the resolution, which is the word different. Now, if my opponent and I agree that that we need to decide what is fundamentally different or the same about humans and other animals, then the most important question we need to be paying attention to is what degree of difference qualifies being different. And my argument is that the arguments which my opponent has dropped are sufficient to prove that the degree of separation between humans and other animals is large. Even if it's just these two things, those two things are differences which are essential. And that is the most critical issue in this debate. The fact that humans, and the two things I'm mentioning are that humans are uniquely capable of developing mathematical theories, and secondly, that humans are uniquely capable of confronting questions that are purely ethical. These two arguments went unaddressed by my opponent, and therefore they are the most important issues to consider in this debate because they qualify the differences between humans and other species. And so now that I've ended this, so that was what I might say as the affirmative speaker. And as I'm flowing the debate, this is what I might write, which is to say that not only do they concede the definition, they're conceding basically the interpretation of the word fundamental as it relates to the resolution, and the affirmative is basically saying that they conceded the framework. Now, the next thing that I would write is any degree of difference is still difference, and extending these two arguments about the development of mathematics and the humans confronting purely ethical questions. These are absolutely extendable because they were dropped, as the affirmative just said. And another argument which is critical here is that any degree of difference is still difference. So the affirmative has extended these arguments and proven and shown that they qualify enough to affirm the resolution, especially since the negative has agreed in part to the affirmative framework, which interprets the word fundamental as being what is essentially different. And since these two things are pretty significantly different and the negative doesn't have a response for that, the affirmative should win. That's the summary of the affirmative consolidation speech so far. But of course, the affirmative has more to say. Across from the second point on the framework, the negative had said that human society is not harmonious or balanced, but the affirmative can say that, yes, that is true, but the way that we strive for harmony and balance, which is through these complex moral theories, is very different and far more complex than anything that other animals have come up with. So across from this point about the evolution, the affirmative in their consolidation might say something like, the negative misunderstands what I was trying to say in my contention one, which is that humans reside on a different biological playing field. So basically we are separated from other animals because we have these massive intellects. It's not about biological necessity in the evolutionary sense. It is simply about the fact that we are so distinct from these other animals that we are essentially different. There it is. So next thing that the affirmative does, so notice the affirmative has done a very good job so far. There's a few more arguments though, and the affirmative is beginning to run out of time in the consolidation. So what do? They group these arguments on subpoint A. And subpoint A, again, the affirmative believes that they can group them because they're all across from subpoint A. So they should be relatively interconnected by the concept of rationalization, right? So they all should be related to rationalization, which is why the affirmative believes that they can group them. But the affirmative doesn't outright say that why they're grouping them. They don't need to. They just say, I'm going to group these two arguments and provide the response that humans are far more complex due to our vast intellect. So even though animals do communicate in complex ways, and even though there's evidence that animals do rationalize, humans are way more complex in the ways that we communicate and rationalize because we have vast intellects. And finally, because they're running out of time, they have to make a last-ditch argument here. So they say, across from this argument from Professor Saeed Al-Jabi, they say, one example does not adequately respond, especially because monkeys are not evaluating purely ethical questions. So true, the negative argument here is relatively weak. It is only one example of an animal that has a moral system, and it doesn't do a good job of responding to the complexity of the moral systems, which makes human moral systems very distinct, is that they're way more complex. And especially this purely ethical questions thing. No monkey is sitting there philosophizing about purely ethical questions. They might be considering ethical things, but they act on them and they don't simply philosophize about them, and they're not purely ethical, right? There's always consequences involved in the animal world. Whereas for humans, it's just philosophy when we're talking about ethics. So finally, the neg rationale. Now, this is a tough position for the negative to be in because the affirmative has made a very strong case for the affirmative framework and has shown that they win on the affirmative framework in the sense that there are things which make humans different from other animals that the negative didn't have a response to in the first place. So the negative either has to have really good responses to these development of mathematical theories and confronting purely ethical questions, or they need to sort of untie those arguments from the framework and win on the framework. And the negative is in a very tough position because they agreed to the framework in the first place. So it's actually very challenging for the negative at this point in the debate. On this side, now keep in mind, this is only one half of the debate, and we're not looking at what's happening on the negative constructive side of the debate. The affirmative could very well be losing very hard on that side of the debate. We don't really know. It doesn't really matter. That's not the purpose of this exercise. In any case, though, it is difficult for the negative to respond here with a good response. And remember, this is the last speech in the debate. Okay, so across from the framework, the negative says, so what the affirmative had initially tried to say is that there are properties that we share, essential properties that we share with other organisms, and there are essential properties that we do not share with other organisms. The question is the degree of difference to qualify whether we are different enough from other animals. What the negative is then saying is that if it is true that organisms share fundamental things and we also don't share fundamental things, then it must be fundamentally true that we do not share properties. Therefore, we must be fundamentally the same because we fundamentally share the property that we don't share fundamental properties. It's a very confusing argument, and I apologize if it's confusing, but it is a good argument, in my opinion, if it can be understood. I wouldn't make this kind of argument if you are with a less experienced judge who's not going to be paying attention to this kind of complexity. They're more going to be paying attention to the way that you're speaking and the way that you're tying arguments together. So this is an argument, and it's okay. but it probably isn't going to decide the round. It's not going to decide who the winner is. Okay, so the negative in the rationale speech doesn't have that much time, and they recognize that this second point on the framework about harmony and balance is really not that important in the debate. So they drop it. They don't care. The affirmative probably didn't talk about it in their rationale, and that's a good idea. If your opponent doesn't talk about it in their rationale, there's no reason for you to talk about it in your rationale. You just need to be talking about the most important issues in the debate. And at this point, it's just kind of going back and forth on the harmony balance thing, and it's not very essential to the framework and other issues that have become very important in the debate. So it's okay to drop it. So the negative says, so what the affirmative had tried to say was that the negative conceded the affirmative framework in its entirety, but the negative didn't concede the entire framework. They just conceded the definition for the word fundamental. And so the definition for the word fundamental, according to the negative, can still work with the negative side. But we'll see. And so again, about this evolutionary back and forth, this argument here on across from contention 1, again, it's not a very important issue in the debate. It's just kind of going back and forth at this point. The negative recognizes that they could have an argument about it, but they could make a better argument that's more central to the debate with the time that they're given, especially because hopefully the negative is going to make some arguments here and then go on to voting issues. So the negative really doesn't have all that much time in the rationale. But the argument that they do make, which is a good argument, is that this group here is unqualified. So when the affirmative tried to group these arguments together and come up with one argument to respond to both of them, they can't do that because this one argument doesn't clash with the second argument at all. So given that, the negative extends the second argument, and you can kind of see that this argument is kind of the only thing at this point that the negative has. And so it's their strongest argument on this side of the flow, and so they extend it and they say that this is one of the most important issues in the round. Now, hopefully they do say that. That's what you're supposed to say. Now, across from the affirmative's extensions here, the negative now tries to make a scramble, a last-ditch effort to respond to these extensions by talking about how this math example is actually being used to prove that rationalization is a fundamental property of humans. But since the affirmative dropped the argument about from Joyce Shumley, which said that animals do rationalize and rationalization is not unique to humans, we see that the rationalization argument fails from the affirmative side, and therefore this math argument fails on the affirmative side. And finally, the same thing can be said about this confronting questions that are purely ethical. So what the affirmative overall is trying to say is that the intellect and the capability for rationalization lead to these things such as mathematical theories and confronting purely ethical questions. And those two properties are very distinct from other animals. But what the negative is trying to say is that all of these aspects and properties have the fundamental property of being rationalization. And since rationalization is not unique to humans, it is very clear that humans are not unique in this universe, that we are fundamentally, we share enough with other animals to be considered fundamentally the same. So that is the debate on the affirmative side. On the negative side, again, anything could have happened, so we don't really know who the winner is. And you can kind of evaluate the strength of these arguments. Personally, I think that the cross application here, this XA of the Shumley argument, doesn't really work for the mathematical theories. I actually think that the affirmative is trying to say something a little bit different than rationalizing is the central thing that makes us different from other animals. I don't think that that's necessarily the affirmative's case. I think the affirmative is more trying to say what makes us fundamentally different is enough to prove that the resolution is true, which is that humans are fundamentally different from other animals. But the negative has not had an adequate response to that. Unless they have a really good argument on their side of the flow, I do want to say that the affirmative is 1. Certainly, I think that the affirmative is 1 on this side of the flow, the affirmative side of the flow. So, all right, that's it. That's the end here. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. I do hope you were taking notes. I'm very excited to sort of see these things in action, and I'm looking forward to continuing to teach and maybe even making more videos. So happy days, everyone, and good luck in your next debate.